Welcome everyone. My name is Lori Berman. I'm Vice President of Membership and Development for the Small Business Association of Michigan. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar presented by Shepherd Advisors. It's one in webinars that we have for our small businesses across the state of Michigan. We did one a couple weeks ago with Shepherd, and today is about culture, a very important topic as our businesses, our workforce are faced with the COVID pandemic. We have some great speakers here with us today to share their expertise and help us to get through some of the questions that you have right now. Today, we ask that you use the chat feature for some engagement that our speakers will be asking you to do later. We also have Q&A. You can post questions out there. I ask that you keep your questions focused on what is going on in today's content. If you have a question about a loan or something else, send that to sbam@sbam.org. We appreciate you being here. We will have this recorded. It's on Facebook. It is also will be live on, it's live on Zoom, but we will have that recording for you along with the slides. So take advantage of this. Let me introduce to you our speakers without further ado. Today we have Locke McCabe. Locke is the owner and founder of Shepherd Advisors. Locke focuses on strategy, methodical research, sound growth strategy development, and building robust foundations for successful and sustainable growth. Ed Holinsky is here today talking to us about culture, no surprise. Ed is a business and transformation leader who helps organizations accelerate and sustain growth. He specializes in growth strategy clarification, leadership development, and culture change. Ed uses organization development as a growth lever. And then last but not least is Sheila Martinez. Sheila is a founder of H3 Workplace Solutions. For the past 20 years, Sheila has helped hundreds of organizations solve complex business issues by implementing people's strategies, practices, and programs to maximize their full potential. Sheila can help your organization to create a happy, healthy, and human workplace that powers performance. So without further ado, I will let you all take it away.
Thank you very much, Lori. This is Ed Holinsky. It's great to be with you today and great to be with the attendees. Thank you folks for taking the time to join us. This is a topic you'll find as we go through that all of us are passionate about, and we hope we can help you perhaps think differently about it as a result of some of the things that we go through today. So what I'd like to do is first start with Locke and have him talk a little bit about Shepherd Advisors and the role that it plays in its relationship with SBAM, and then I'll talk in more detail about how the culture piece fits into that. Locke, could you give us a quick overview, please?
Absolutely, Ed. Thank you very much. It's just a real pleasure to be here and to really share with you all this other dimension of the new dimension of the work that we do. We've had the blessing of working with SBAM for the better part of, I don't know, almost 15 years at this point, helping SBAM companies grow more successfully. We have a team at Shepherd Advisors that of experts and experienced CEOs and practitioners. We come together specifically to help companies build and experience again resilient and sustainable growth. And we do this through a crucial combination of not only strategy, which at its core is where are we going, how are we going to get there, what are the key trade-offs we need to make, what are the key decisions we need to make, and now let's get focused and go. With now culture, the DNA of a company, the part of the company that is going to really ensure that the strategy gets executed effectively or may undermine the strategy actually being executed effectively. And so we have just become more and more appreciative that strategy and culture go hand in hand together, especially then when that comes together to be executed more effectively. And so we now have at Shepherd Advisors not only strategy and culture, but a real focus on executional go power. It is with great pleasure and gratitude that I now hand the microphone over to Ed and Sheila, who are going to just help all of us think much more effectively about culture, what we have, what we want, and how we move from where we are to where we want to be. Ed, back to you.
Thanks, Locke. Appreciate that. So, Sheila, could you talk to us a little bit about what culture is as a level setter for this conversation, please?
Yeah, absolutely, Ed. Thank you. So what is culture? Culture is a vague term, difficult to define, but often quite easy to recognize when you walk into an organization or meet with the team. At its essence, an organization's cultures are the underlying beliefs, assumptions, values, and ultimately ways of interacting that are unique to its that working environment. It's how work gets done, how colleagues interact, how decisions are made, and ultimately how your business shows up to customers, partners, suppliers, and other stakeholders. As we all know, there's been extensive discussion and research on culture in business literature over the last number of years, and the evidence is quite clear. Organizations that are intentional about their culture simply tend to do better. So stronger cultures provide guideposts, if you will, which allow organizations to better capitalize on opportunities or thrive in the unknown. So as a starting point, we would love to find out a little bit more about your culture. So I'll pass it on to Ed, who will take us through a chat exercise.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sheila. Yeah, just in the spirit of being open and listening, we would rather not talk at you for the next 40 minutes. So we'd love to get your perspective on how you would describe your culture in your organization. Could you take just a couple minutes, go to the chat box on the bar, open that up and type in 2 to 3 words on how you would describe your cultures. We'd love to use that as a way to connect with you as we go through this and talk about how these points might help those cultures. And that, for those of you who don't see it readily, on mine it's 3 bubbles on the right side on the toolbar. If you click on that, it'll show the chat, or roll over on that. Click on the chat, and then it should be preset for all panelists and attendees, and just type in a couple words, please, that describe culture.
Within your context and within your business.
Yep. Thanks, Sheila. Locke, I'm eager to see what you're going to enter in.
We have one that says mostly top down. Thanks. You.
Yeah, thanks, Julie.
Supportive, innovative, small groups, all managers.
Sarah, could you expand on that just a bit in chat in terms of, does that mean it's a management-driven organization, even though it's a small organization? It'd be interesting to me to have just a little more definition on that, if you could.
Okay, patriarchal, but in flux due to ownership changes. So you're sort of going through a cultural transition there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robin.
Yeah, that's great. It's an interesting dynamic.
Isn't it? Anyone else?
Thank you, Locke. Okay. So with those as inputs, thank you very much for sharing that. We'll try to connect with those as we go through. Thanks, Sarah, for expanding on that. Got it. Okay, that's helpful.
Got it.
Yep, thank you.
But actually, that is an interesting point, because your culture isn't simply just your employees. It's it's everyone you partner with, whether they're freelancers or the gig economy or partners. So that's an interesting point that Sarah's brought up there, Ed.
Yeah, it really is. We got a couple interesting dynamics to focus on. So thank you. So let me share why we think culture is important at this point. think it's important enough to have joined us today, and we've got a definitive point of view on that as to why we believe it's important. First of all, culture is probably the greatest untapped determinant of organizational performance. And what we mean by that is that it sometimes is easy to focus on things that are more concrete. You know, it's easy to think about compensation as an example as a big lever in an organization. And a lot of people operate under the illusion that if you just change comp, you're going to change behaviors, and then are frustrated that that doesn't happen. Sometimes it'll be the organizational structure, because it's easier to deal with the black and white, with the boxes and wires on a chart, than it is to deal with behaviors that are problematic in the organization. So culture not only is not as black and white, but it can be quite amorphous. You know, in some cases it's evolved in organizations, it's happened organically. So it just has sort of defined itself based on the makeup of the organization. Our belief is that it's important to be intentional about it. So first, understand what you have and why it is the way it is, and then actively manage it if you want to try to improve the culture. And the reason is, unless you have an engaged and adaptable culture, you're probably not going to have the performance that you're looking for. There are a couple significant bodies of research that have been done that show that if everything else is static and just the culture changes, it's going to drive performance significantly. So it is important to focus on it, even though it may not be the easiest thing to change in an organization. Further, we believe that resilient and innovative cultures are paramount in today's environment, where in a more static and slow-moving environment, it was okay to move systematically, methodically, and change in a more deliberate way. Today, it's important to be able to pivot rapidly, to innovate much more rapidly. We're talking with organizations where it took them years, months, in some cases, to do things, and today they're doing it in weeks and days, because there is no time to waste to survive through this and then come out stronger on the other side. And then finally, we believe that openness and listening are essential elements to begin the journey toward resilience and innovation. Irrespective of what your values are in the organization or your cultural attributes, if you don't start with openness and listening as enablers, you're probably not going to have the kind of culture and environment that you need in order to perform the way that you'd like to perform. Okay. So Sheila, could you share with us what you think an open and listening culture looks like?
Sure, thanks, Ed. So an open culture is one that creates or reframes a mindset where biases are minimized and people are encouraged and rewarded actually for new ways of solving problems through diverse points of view. As far as listening, that's a place for a culture where employees feel they have a voice that matters and have the opportunity to add value to the organization regardless where they stand within the hierarchy. Every organization is different, obviously, and has different dynamics. And therefore, every example of open and listening cultures is a bit unique. But based on our experiences and clients that we've worked with, there are 5 characteristics that we've found that sort of have that basic condition for openness and listening. The first one really being transparency. And at its core, leaders and employees are authentic and honest with each other. Decisions are transparent to the extent that everyone affected by them understands the process and the arguments that led to them. Another characteristic is they are inclusive, meaning they not only welcome diverse points of view, but actually seek them. They're curious. They implement specific mechanisms for inviting multiple perspectives into a dialogue or a conversation whenever possible. And this is both within the organization and externally as well. Opening and listening cultures tend to be highly adaptive and fundamentally oriented towards continuous engagement and learning. These cultures are collaborative, so people tend to believe that working together creates better results than working alone or in silos or in competition. And then finally, they have a strong sense of shared values and purpose. And what's most interesting is oftentimes these shared values and purpose are more influential within the organization than a person's role or their position within the hierarchy. So that's what open and listening cultures are. And I'm going to pass it on to Ed now, who's going to talk a little bit about why it's so critical today based on the context that businesses are working within.
Thanks, Sheila, very much. So if it's that important, why now with everything else that's going on around us today? It seems like we've got enough to juggle without having to think about changing our culture. So stop and think for a moment about what we do have happening. And it seems like it's been years that we've been at this because of the weight it's put on a lot of us, but it really has just been this year, right? It's several months where we've been hit by COVID. So we've hit the downside of that. We thought we were on the crest and coming back, and now we're seeing the potential for a second wave on that, which makes people weary. As a result of that, we've seen an economic downturn that's been devastating for some businesses, existential for some. As a result of that, people are continuing to wonder, will I have a job? What's it going to look like? How long will it be? They're creating a great deal of uncertainty. And add to that the fact that the work environment itself has changed. You know, in an effort to be attentive and protective of employees, leaders have helped them to stay where they're at safely as long as they can. In some cases have brought back portions of the workforce, or they're operating with hybrid models, which presents new challenges. And then layered on top of that, in recent past, we've also been dealing with greater racial awareness as a result of some of the things that have received a great deal of publicity. And that's created tension. You know, it's created awkwardness because people in some cases want to do something to make a difference. They don't know how to approach it, what to say in a way that's not offensive to someone else. So all those things together have created higher levels of anxiety and uncertainty for us individually and for cultures, and it's a challenge. So we've all experienced these shocks, and Sheila will talk in more depth about what that looks like uniquely for each of us based on circumstances. But the net line is that it's starting to change our expectations. You know, as a result of what we've gone through, with all of these things happening around us, depending on how we've experienced it, it's kind of changed the way we think about things, think about ourselves, think about the world we operate in and the work environment. So it's important to know that people may come back differently than they left. And it's important for you to know what that might look like when they return as different people. So Sheila, could you share with us some of the things that we've seen and heard through our work together?
Yeah, certainly. So as you mentioned, Ed, you know, they've been extraordinary times. There's no doubt about that. We'll all remember this, that's for sure. And people have had a similar experience, but people have had the same experience, but they haven't experienced it the same, if that makes sense. You know, based on people that I've spoken to, you know, there are people out there who are looking at work differently, how they work, where they work, when they work. Many people I've spoken to have become closer with their family. I have a client that I've worked with for 5 years, and prior to this, I had no idea she had a family. And through working with her through the pandemic, I found out she has 3 kids, actually got a chance to meet them through Zoom calls. So you know, that private, the personal, professional life has really blended, and you're starting to meet people in a much more authentic way. Others, of course, are afraid to leave their homes, worried about relatives. People are struggling with big issues, such as job loss, schooling for kids now that school's starting, racial tension. So there's been a lot on people's plate. It hasn't all been negative. I've also spoken to some that have found peace and a stronger sense of purpose with the slowdown, that giving them an opportunity to reflect and sort of be quiet. The point being about the mix of experiences and emotion really falls on the fact that people bring their humanity to work every day, whether they physically go into a location or if they're working virtually. And that humanity brings with it emotions, stressors, and circumstances that ultimately impact performance and the vibe within an organization. So traditionally, organizations and leaders have shied away from emotions at work. You know, it's something that's abstract, complex, kind of tricky to talk about. But what we're suggesting is in today's time, it is virtually impossible to ignore what's happening within the context of people's lives. And if organizations and leaders can't have open conversations and really get to some of the deeper issues, it'll be counterproductive, costly, and can actually hinder a business's ability to recover. So Ed, I'll pass it on to your slide here where you can talk about that connection between emotion and performance.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sheila. So the myriad of experiences that Sheila talked about, and as you're getting a sense, it's multifaceted depending on your individual circumstances. It's just as complex with regard to the emotions that it's generating with people individually. So when they come back in, whether they re-enter directly into the workplace or just getting reassimilated to a hybrid, you may see some signs of that. You may see some things that we point out on the top left of this chart where they feel frustrated, they're anxious, or in some cases even angry based on what they've had to deal with or certain things that are going on in the workplace where they might feel they're getting dismissed without being given their due. Those sometimes are easier to deal with when you see those and are able to manage it. The things that are more challenging are those that sit below the sight line. And some folks are going to come back somewhat apathetically. They may have a different point of view on the importance of work and how they fit into the world. They may be more indifferent than they were when they left, and they may be inattentive. It doesn't mean in that case that they care less about the work. It just may mean that they're distracted because they have a parent that they may have to look after that they can't connect with because of COVID. They may have other things that they're experiencing with. It's a heavy load while they're at work that keeps them from focusing exclusively on the work at hand. So our job as leaders really is to help them move from the left side of this ledger to the right side. And starting with the bottom to get them to a point where they're more relaxed, contented, curious again, and ideally receptive to where you want to take the business so that they can contribute to that in a meaningful way. Ultimately, you'd like to help them move up to the top right quadrant so that they start to show the determination that's required and the motivation to help the business pivot and thrive through what we're going through right now, and ultimately to become passionate. You know, we weren't very good from a business perspective, even pre-COVID. You know, engagement levels were quite low globally, and this is an opportunity really to not just help connect with people where they're at today, but actually come back in a better way to have them be more motivated because of the way you're connecting with them. The one thing I would stress on this, it's no longer good enough to treat people as groups of employees, to say we'll do mass marketed communications and just assume that everybody's going to receive it the right way. Communications need to be more individualized today. You need to understand where they're at. You need to talk about it. You need to listen. You then need to tailor your comments to them in a way where they're going to be relevant and helpful, as opposed to thinking that you can broadcast things that are going to get people moving in unison in the organization. I'm afraid that's a day that's gone by for those types of communications. So Sheila, recognizing all those needs, could you talk a little bit about how that matches up against the capabilities with most leadership teams today?
Sure. So, you know, there's no doubt that leaders play a central role in modeling and reinforcing culture. And in times of uncertainty, stress, and navigating the unknown, which we're all experiencing right now, we tend to go to leadership styles that have worked for us in the past or that we see displayed within organizations. So some of the common ones are the visionary, right? The leader at the front of the crowd that's rallying the troops, setting the stage, showing the way. Typically, this is the founder, CEO, owner of an organization. You have the planner who is organized and disciplined, reviews and analyzes data, mitigates risk, and helps keep the organization on course. You have the doer, essentially the person that gets stuff done, takes action, reaches goals, and really focuses on performance. You know, while these top three leadership styles have their time and place and organizations need them, what's most in demand right now, and perhaps in shortest supply, is the fact that we need connectors. So connectors are those people who are those leaders who focus on people. They have a knack of understanding how human performance works and what motivates people to do their best and go the extra mile. They're known for building authentic and trust-based environments. And they have honed their leadership and people skills, so they're able to navigate at all levels within an organization by engaging in a meaningful way. So connectors know instinctively that unless you care about people, it's difficult to engage and inspire them. If you can inspire and engage your workforce, well, then ultimately your organization won't perform at its full potential.
Yeah.
So
And
Go ahead.
Sheila, I would add, Sarah was kind enough to share that she's feeling isolated, from her coworkers, as a result of what we've gone through. I think that's representative of many of us today, whether we're physically or virtually located, even on site. When you're masked and keeping distance, it doesn't bridge that connection that we crave from a human perspective. So could you talk a little bit about that, how this, how they can help to deal with that isolation for folks?
Yeah, and I think that's a very valid point. I actually went through to my first in-person meeting last week. We were sitting around a conference room and, of course, physically distancing, but we all had masks on. It was difficult to hear people. I really felt that connecting with people in that environment as I used to, I couldn't do it at that level of in a meaningful way. So that isolation requires you to actually reach out in other ways. So a lot more follow-up when meeting with people. As leaders, making sure that you're connecting with people on a regular daily basis as check-ins, not just as business as usual. Asking questions about, hey, how are you doing? How are you experiencing this? How is this impacting you and your work? Is there a way that I can help? So it really is being actually quite deliberate and practical about reaching out and helping those that are feeling isolated feel connected again. And, this takes practice. It's a skill to develop. But when you do, you actually start creating, you start creating those behaviors in others. And where you want to go with your organization, particularly right now in that state of isolation, is have as many connectors so people understand what is happening not only internally within the organization, but have a good sense of what customers need, where the market is going from a product and service development perspective, and really what the organization can do to recover in a much more, in a better way than it was before.
Yeah, and it was interesting this morning that we did a session, and one of the participants, as a group, they're focusing on this connector capability. They're actually reading a book together called Shine by Ed Hallowell, which is quite good on some tips for connecting as an organization. So it's important to know that this is a work on for most organizations. There are very few that really have this right. Many of them have reduced it or relegated it to the HR function, saying that's our carer in chief or our connector in chief, and that's not good enough anymore. You really have to have the whole leadership team engaged and thinking that they need to connect with people and do it in a different way than they've done in the past. So this has to be a capability, not just for the team, but for each individual within that team. And we all, I think, have opportunities to get better at it. So let me share with you. Sheila and I have both worked in a risk environment for one of the largest risk organizations in the world for a few years, doing transformational projects. So we're comfortable with risk, we're familiar with risk, and when we see risk, we also see opportunity. And I think at this moment, there is a great risk if you don't do something to respond to all the things we talked about in these previous slides, and that's on the lower part of this slide. If you're not attentive and don't decide as a team you're going to make it a priority, employees may feel disenfranchised. There might be less trust in the organization with the managers and the leadership, and as a result of that, they're going to be less productive and slower to help you adopt changes and adapt to the external environment. On the top side, if you do take some steps and start to move in this direction, and you can't cure for this overnight, but even moving in the right direction is going to send a signal that people are important. And if you do that, they're going to feel more secure and become more productive. Leaders will develop their emotional intelligence and hopefully increase their empathy by paying attention to this. It's self-validating in some ways. When you ask a question and someone shares with you something that is personal and difficult for them to share, it builds a bond unlike what you had before that conversation. So empathy just comes out of that almost naturally by having those conversations. And then finally, your organization will be viewed as being more trusting. It'll attract the kind of talent that you want and help you to hold that good talent by becoming more resilient and more innovative. And this is not a nice to do. This is a must do because there's quite a bit of research on the correlation between people feeling psychologically safe, engagement, and then performance as a result of that. We cite one study here where people that are actively engaged perform at 3 times the performance level or productivity of people that are actively disengaged. That's compelling. So, and the thing about this right now, for me, this is almost counterintuitive. You know, it feels to people like there are so many things that are going on around you that the easiest thing is to just get back, snap into place, and let's get back to business as usual, where that could actually be the worst thing to do. People will come back, they'll think that you're inattentive, uncaring. If you just put your head down and say, let's get the job done, we've got time to make up and we've got to survive here. If you don't connect with them personally, you're probably going to miss a big opportunity. So where that might seem like it's a safe path, it's actually the risky path to do nothing. And our belief is the smart path and being risk intelligent is to do something about it. Even though it's clumsy, even though it's awkward, it may feel uncomfortable. The more you do it, the more comfortable you'll become as you start to take steps in this direction. So start those conversations. Go back and ask someone how they're doing. Ask them about their family member. Ask them about how they're feeling about things and what you can do to be supportive as a leader in the organization. That's an important first step. It does start with mindset, and then the behaviors follow from that. Sheila, could you share a little bit about what we've learned and sort of best practices for leaders and organizations, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you've touched on some of it, Ed, in terms of we encourage organizations to start taking steps towards making openness and listening a core capability within their organization. And you mentioned psychological safety, and creating that is really one of the first steps. You know, it was coined by Amy Edmondson, and she describes it as the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, or mistakes within a team environment. So that creating that environment is really crucial. And it's not just leaders who do it, organizational systems do it as well, and employees. And that's that sense of transparency and honesty, authenticity that we spoke about. So creating that environment is really that first step. And there's some great research out there, not only a Google study that was done on it, but some great tips that you can take to start creating that within your team. The second is about, the simple steps, making conscious efforts, as you mentioned, Ed, to connect with people in a meaningful way every day. Organizations that I've been working with thus far have done a lot of one-way communication. They've told people where they are, what's the status of the return to work program, where the PPE information is. It's time to open up those channels for it to be two-way communication and creating processes, systems, and forums that allow people to express themselves and share ideas and perspectives. Of course, this isn't all about, their feelings right now. Of course, that's an element of it, but here's a rich source of information for any organization to get some additional perspective on how do you recover and become better once this will pass, because this too shall pass. As mentioned before, leaders are central to creating this type of culture, and it's about leaders listening differently, making an effort and trying to build that trust and trusting others as autonomy is becoming more commonplace now, with people working virtually or shift work where people don't see each other as much. And one of the key components here is taking the time to be present and really listening to people, not to answer or to respond, but really to understand. And most important thing that leaders can do right now is encourage and reward others who demonstrate these behaviors. And these small steps start creating an environment, an informal operating model that will eventually become a core part of a culture if it's done consistently and it's done authentically, Ed.
That's great, Sheila. And I think that's the Oxygen project, wasn't it, at Google that you were talking about, in case folks want to look that up on.
Yeah, or maybe it was Aristotle. We can send a follow-up. We'll find out what it is, but it's a great study.
Yep. Yeah, it's worthwhile to take a look at that. Thank you. So our key takeaways to summarize what we went through. First, If you're not already doing this, culture should be reframed as a strategic priority. It's not a nice to do that we'll get to later. If you're not focused on it, you're going to lag behind short term and long term. So you really need to understand it, embrace it, and leverage it in a way that's going to help your performance in the organization. The way to do that is for leaders to understand what's required for aspirational culture and to start behaving in a way that's going to move the dial for other people in the organization. Only then will it become cohesive and help you start to pivot to get through this uncertainty and become stronger as a result of going through this. Openness and listening are essential. If you don't master those, it's going to be hard to operationalize the rest of your values, and it will be very difficult to be a learning organization. You know, we're past the era of telling people what to do and then monitoring them to make sure they follow through on it and thinking that's good enough. Today, it really is about, tell me what you think should be done. Let's figure that out together, and then tell me what kind of help you need as you're trying to attack this, because I'll support you in any way that I can. That's a different mindset. That's a different conversation, and it'll help the organization to become much more resilient. And the first step, as Sheila walked through with you, is really to engage in those different types of conversations, understand where they are, what they need, and what they like. It's that simple, you know, and the rest may seem overwhelming. It may seem complex, but if you take the first step, I think much of that will start to fall into place. You'll get more comfortable and find that it's not that difficult to do the next thing coming out of that. So what we'd like to do with all that in mind is get a sense from you as participants, please. What resonated with you of some of these themes that we went through today? And are there particular things that you would take back and act on in your environment that you think is readily implementable? So could you take just a moment and go to the chat box again and just enter in either what resonated with you today or what your takeaway is that you're going to put into play in your company. And if it's nothing, let us know that too, because we'd love to have the feedback on the, you know, whether we affected your view and did something that's going to move you to action. If not, we don't like to know that as well. I'll give you a couple minutes to start entering that in. Sarah, for you in particular, is there anything that you took away from this to deal with the isolation that you were talking about that might be helpful?
So Julie's gotten back to us, and it's important when you're doing the chat, thanks Julie, that I think you could do all panelists and everyone or attendees as well, so everyone can see what has been written. But I always try to work on connecting with others. I didn't realize how COVID changed the need to put more focus on connecting. It really has. It's not only just on the emotional level, but on the physical level too. So that's a great point. Park has talked a bit about inclusiveness not only brings the organization closer together, but it can create more opportunities for success. And that is so true. That diverse perspective, oftentimes some of the most brilliant ideas within our organization are the gems and are very in an unexpected place. So creating that inclusivity where everyone has the opportunity to contribute is just simply makes business sense.
Yeah, it's a very basic human need to feel that sense of belonging. And if people are embraced and feel it, they're going to operate quite differently than without it.
So Sarah mentioned, yep, sorry, Sarah mentioned she knew connecting was important now, but this reinforces the need. You know, something else I'll put out there to the group. What have you been doing to connecting? Is there any best practices or any ideas that you've had that have worked well for you? It'd be great to share it with the team and share it with us as well, because we love to learn from everyone on this.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ed, sorry.
Yeah, and Locke asked the question about improving openness and listening across multiple cultures, which is a great call out. I think we should recognize that culture is not one thing in an organization. There are actually subcultures within organizations, depending on the business unit, the leadership. There are dynamics that make each one just a little more nuanced in the organization. You aspire to core values that are similar across, and that's worth working hard at to make sure those exist, but they will be slightly different depending on the leadership and the dynamic within that group. So with that in mind, openness and listening really takes on a more significant role, because people are not going to behave the same across the organization. You need to take the time to listen. Some of that may be driven by their function. Some of it may be driven by the way they face the marketplace, and they have to change accordingly, and it creates a little bit different dynamic and culture. So you have to be attentive to that and want to understand why that may be different and why that may create strength in the organization, actually having some of those differences and some of those subcultures. So thank you for that question, Locke. And I'll go on to Robin as well. May I, Sheila, to tackle that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Robin's question, I'll read it to the bigger group. The need for all levels to communicate more and make it a two-way street. I know this, but convincing my supervisors of this is tough sometimes. Robin, I really appreciate you calling that out. I think many of us in organizations have been accustomed to people where it's a tell environment. You know, I know what needs to be done. We've decided this is a leadership team. Let's communicate it concisely and compellingly, and people will just do it and everything will be okay. And I think type A's tend to dominate that, you know, where it's let's get on with it, let's get moving. I'm going to show you where we're going, just follow me. And I think more and more people respect confidence. They don't respect overconfidence or confidence that isn't justified. So I think there's a bit about, we think we know where we want to go, but you know what? We may be missing some things. Could you share with us your perspective and what you're seeing from your seat? Because it would really be useful to have a better rounded perspective on what's happening around us. If you don't get that bigger view, you're much more likely to make mistakes as a company. So that's a battle that's worth fighting with leadership and management in the organization, to say it's okay to communicate to people what's going on. That's important, but it's not sufficient. You really need to listen as much as you communicate today in order to make sure that you're connecting with them where they are, and then bringing them along as individuals, as people, you know, not employees, not skill sets, but as people, to what Sheila talked about earlier. They come in as humans, and that's the way you want to think of them when they're on the job. Do you want to tackle the next one, Sheila?
Well, just back to Robin's point, I think it's important to understand the difference between sending a message and a message that's actually landed. So supervisors tend to say, oh, I sent the email, or you know, I let them know about it, but that's not dialogue. That's not a conversation. That's just that one-way communication that we've been talking about. So it's about convincing supervisors and actually having a mindset conversation with them about why it's important to have that give and take to dialogue. You might have sent something, but that didn't resonate with the person. It didn't land. They didn't get what you meant. They had a different perspective about it that you didn't find out about. So, you know, we talked about how do you create less isolation, particularly during these times. One of my pieces of advice is to pick up the phone, talk to people. Things get lost in translation, a lot of emails and texts and things of that nature. So there's a real value in engaging in dialogue as opposed to using mediums that are just one way, or typically are one way with responses back and forth.
So Julie had a comment as well, or a question. Do you have ideas on how to move people from negative relaxed to positive active to pivot and thrive? Thank you, Julie. It's a great question. And I think the first step in that is to have conversations in a way where you start to surface the negative relaxed. So as I said when we went through that slide, some of those things aren't going to hit the sight line. And unless you take the time and you're present in the conversation, as Sheila said, and ask provocative questions, you know, how are you feeling? Tell me what you've experienced, how that's impacted you. What would be most helpful to you today for me to do to support you so that you can operate the way you'd like to operate? I think the worst thing you could do is ignore it. Maybe the next worst thing is to ask and then say, let's get back to it now. I've heard you, let's get back to work and do what needs to be done. I think there's a bit about accommodating them to So not just understanding, but saying, you know, might it be helpful to have an afternoon off, you know, for you to deal with your parent that's not doing well? Or is there something else we could do to be supportive of you personally? Because you'll find those accommodations that you make may seem big in the moment, but you're going to get more than a multiple return on that by being attentive to them and helping them with whatever they're dealing with. So it's important to understand it, starting with the conversations, important to do something about it, and ideally to be supportive in a way where they're going to feel like they've got an advocate and they'll start to move to the other side of the ledger. And I realize there are constraints on what we can do. You can't solve for some of their personal issues, but you can be supportive. You can make sure that you're doing whatever you can do in the work environment to support that part of their life that they're dealing with. They're not looking for you to solve their personal problems. They're realistic enough to know what's achievable and what's not achievable, but they also know that if you care, it's going to make it easier for them to know that they've got somebody that's understanding and accommodating in the workplace.
Yeah, you can't really underestimate the power of being heard and feeling valued. You know, as it's part of who we are as people. And it sounds quite simple, but even small steps like that starts creating that shift. And again, as Ed said, you know, you can accommodate to a certain extent. Sometimes it's more difficult, but having that communication and letting people know that there is room for dialogue is quite powerful in itself.
Yeah. And then Locke, you had a question about how to effectively bring people along when there are multiple pivots, which is good also, because I think most businesses, it's not a once and done anymore. It really is about incrementally moving toward where they need to go. So I think it's important to be attentive, not just to the strategy in those cases and what needs to be done, you know, with the mechanics of getting it right for the marketplace, but also to think about the capabilities and the culture that's needed to support that pivot. Are you lined up against it? Are you asking people to do things that they're capable of doing? Are you supporting them in a way where they can get from one to the next? If not, what needs to be done to be more supportive? And there may be capability building in there as well as culture change, you know, as you think about what's needed to support that pivot. I think a lot of companies today, and you and I've had conversations with some of them, they look at that silver bullet and say, wouldn't it be great if, and they think they can just vector to that next idea without paying attention to what capabilities they have in the organization and what culture they have to support that move. So understand what you've got as a starting point, know how it lines up against that next move, and then start thinking about what you need to do to transition both of those in order to support that transition. Is that helpful? Yeah, okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? We wouldn't want to leave anything left unaddressed. If you have some even observations, if there's anything you'd like to share, again, at this point in the chat box.
I was somewhat interested in Park's comment about inclusiveness not only brings the organization closer together, but it can create more opportunities for success. I'm curious if he'd like to share some examples of that, because that really speaks to how culture translates into business performance.
Yep.
Don't mean to point you out, Park, but it was a great point.
And we know you don't have the mic, Park. Could you give us a few bullet points or comments in the chat box on that?
So we'll give him a couple more minutes. He might have logged off, or he's being shy, so we'll wait. Okay, so the openness of the communication enables for new ideas and perspectives that can identify new opportunities that would otherwise not get discovered.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, it's hard to innovate today without knowing those things, right? To have those ideas and perspectives, because we've all got a limited view based on, you know, our groove that we're in for that day. So it's a great point.
You know, interestingly enough, some of the thought leadership that I've heard around COVID and, you know, the new normal is that there's going to be a, you know, breakdown of the traditional hierarchies that we're accustomed to in organizations. And simply because one of the main reasons, beyond the fact that they might not be all that efficient, is the fact that, the top of the house aren't the only people with the ideas right now. It's, it's sideways, it's external people, it's ideas are coming and generating from so many different places, simply because this is uncharted territory and no one has the answers. So you have to be curious and seek those answers. And those that are able to do that and do that in a meaningful way will be those that for sure have that trajectory to success once we start seeing what this new world looks like.
Yeah, great point. Well, it seems like we've come to the end of the question, Sheila. So
Okay.
unless you have anything you want to add at this point, I may just turn it back to Lori.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate your time and attention and all the good feedback as we went through this. It made for a much more productive session. Thank you. Lori, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, well, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Locke, for joining us. Great dialogue today. I appreciate the input of the participants. Thank you for being a part of it. Any closing thoughts that you have, Ed or Sheila, as we leave today? Any top of the mind advice?
Yeah, so mine is do something. There's one idea you could take from anything you heard today, go back and try it, and then talk with other people about what you're doing in the organization. But don't sit still. Don't be satisfied with what you've done in the past or where you're at today. Try something that gets out of your comfort zone.
Right. Excellent. Sheila, how about you?
Yeah, to add to that, it's the small steps that get you there. This doesn't have to be huge. It's the small daily actions that really do make a difference in the long run.
And Locke, any parting words?
Oh, just simply that I've become more and more appreciative of how much an asset culture and particularly effective culture really is. And the sharing, the suggestions, the perspectives, the points of view that you guys have shared this afternoon, I think are really terrific, because it helps all of us understand more fully what we have in our culture and what we can have with the culture, and how do we begin to move towards more and more what it is we really want. I think it's very, very powerful, very cool, and thank you very much.
Oh, great. Thank you again. Good information. Really appreciate the content. For everyone that joined us today, this will be posted online later today along with the slides. If you can send me those slides, Ed, that would be great. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. Everybody have a great day.
Take care. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.